on Chapter 2 of Harris and Me by Gary Paulsen. The chapter entitled, Wherein I Become a Farmer and Meet Vivian. I was dreaming, random firing of neurons through my mind. Something about a fish, and then a neuron shot through, and it became a girl holding a fish, and she was smiling at me, beckoning to me with the fish in an inviting way, but there was a thumping, something thumping, jerking, shaking, and I was awake. It was completely dark, pitch black in the room, and for a few seconds, I couldn't remember where I was. Then a faint light coming through the window revealed the walls, the bed, and standing over me, the figure of Harris. "Come on, wake up!" I looked out the window. It's still night. Doesn't matter. The grown-ups have been coughing for 15 minutes. Get your butt out of there, or Louie will get all the pancakes. Louie. Harris had turned back to his bunk and in one motion jumped into his bib overalls, hooked the suspenders. As previously, the bibs were his only clothing. Who's Louie? He's just Louie. He's an old bugger who lives here and works. You would have met him last night, except he took the tractor down to the beer hall. He came in during the night. I remember the night before now. I'd been given a plate of food because they'd already eaten supper, and I picked at it in the hissing light of an overhead Coleman lantern without thinking or saying much, while Glennis and Claire messed over the sink and stove. Then it was dark and we'd gone to bed. I'd tossed a bit, but finally went to sleep. And I now recalled being slightly awakened by the sound of a loud motor coming down the driveway while I slept. A flare of lights past the window, and then nothing. Harris came to my bed and jerked the covers back. "Get up!" With that, he disappeared out the door, and I heard his feet slapping down the stairs. I tried to close my eyes and go back to sleep. It was black dark outside the window, and everything in me needed sleep. But another pang was there as well, hunger. I hadn't eaten much the night before. And then there was the curiosity as to who or what Louie was, and I rolled out and put my feet on the floor. It only took a moment to shuck into my jeans and pull a t-shirt on, lace up my tennis shoes, and head downstairs, rubbing one hand on the wall to guide my way. But by the time I came out into the kitchen, the table in the dining area was set and everybody was getting ready to eat. As with the previous night, the only light was from a Coleman lantern hanging by a wire from the ceiling. It sighed and burbled away, throwing a flat white glare on the table. Glennis and Claire were at the wood-burning cook stove turning pancakes. Newt and Harris were sitting at the table. Newt was drinking coffee from a mug, wrapping the cup in a hand that could have provided shade, staring at the table with a glazed, early morning look on his face. Harris sat straight up, a fork in one hand, his eyes riveted on an empty spot on the table, staring at the table, his body half shaking. At the end of the table sat an old man in a wool coat. Though it was summer and hot in the kitchen from the wood stove on which the pancakes were cooking. A man so incredibly dirty that it was hard to find a patch of skin on his face or neck not covered with soil or grease. He wore a matted beard stuck with bits of dirt and sawdust and what looked like, and I found later to be, dried manure and dribbled spit and tobacco juice. All this around two piercingly blue gun barrel eyes and a toothless mouth. Louie. I had seen bums in the city looking better, and I tried not to stare as I moved toward the table. Nobody spoke, just nodded and watched the pancakes cooking. And as I sat, Louie took a metal can of log cabin syrup and poured it a 1/4 inch deep in a big puddle on his bare plate. Then he sat forward as Harris was sitting and watched the blank spot on the table with a fork in his hand. There were 2 empty chairs, and I stood for a moment until Glennis motioned to me. "Sit there by Harris." I slid in next to Harris and assumed the other chair was for either Glennis or Claire. It didn't matter because neither of them sat, nor did I ever see them sit to a meal while I was there. Claire cooked, stood over the stove and cooked, and Glennis carried the food to the table. I know they must have eaten, but I never saw them sit down and eat. Harris ignored me, kept sitting with the fork in his hand, staring at the middle of the table so that I wondered if he was in some kind of a trance. Perhaps not fully awake yet? Sleepwalking. God knows. I was having trouble keeping my eyes open. There wasn't a clock anywhere, but it felt like it couldn't be much after midnight, and I figured at the rate things were going, I'd be ready to go back to bed about 10 o'clock in the morning. I noted Harris grow even more tense next to me, and I looked up to see Glennis coming with a stack of pancakes on a plate. They looked delicious, steaming and fluffy, and I felt my mouth start to water. I was not to get any of the pancakes. Before the plate hit the table, Louis leaned forward like a snake striking and hit that stack of pancakes with his fork. At the same instant, Harris made his bid, jabbing for the stack with his fork, but he was too late by miles. The whole stack went to Louis's plate. 7 or 8 of them dropped into the puddle of syrup, hesitated while he poured gobs more syrup on top of them, and then disappeared. With the possible exception of some species of sharks in a feeding frenzy, I have never seen anything eat like Louis. The pancakes were consumed whole. He deftly forked them in the middle, twisted them a half turn, and then speared them back into his toothless mouth, letting his lips squeegee off the excess syrup, which then ran down into his beard, some of it to drip back onto his plate. In some wonderful manner, he would then open his throat and swallow, all without chewing and only half choking. The entire stack was gone in 10 seconds flat, and he was sitting again with his fork in his hand, the syrup dripping from his beard down onto his shirt and lap. "Rats," Harris whispered to me, sighed, and leaned back, shook his shoulders to loosen the tension, and got ready for the next batch. Newt hadn't moved, was still wrapped around the coffee cup, and I stared at Louis in open admiration. He was a machine, completely devoted to feeding itself. Not a word, no wasted motion, just strike and gone. The next stack of cakes was the same, except that Harris caught a corner of one pancake, a tattered remnant that he poured syrup on and ate carefully, chewing for a long time. Louis ate the third stack as well. So far, at least 20 pancakes, but he was slowing, dragged down by food, and when the fourth stack came, he hesitated. Harris was ready, went in low and nailed it and put it on his plate. I thought with a low growl in his throat, but I couldn't be sure. Louis didn't seem to mind and belched softly, a green drifter, the kind of belch that made people move away in a crowded room, and turned, waiting for the next delivery. "Harris, you share now." "But Ma," Glennis turned from the stove, leaned across the table, flicked at Harris with the back of her hand, and I heard her fingers connect with his forehead so hard his head jerked back. He handed me a pancake. "More," Glennis said. "Half." She raised her hand, and he flinched and complied, although he tore the last one in two with his fork, so I didn't quite get half of the whole stack. I didn't care. By this time, I felt lucky to get anything and dripped syrup from the can onto my cakes. Harris had got to it before me and nearly drained it, and I ate quietly. Newt still hadn't moved except to raise his arm and drink the coffee. Glennis refilled his mug twice while we ate, and he drained it both times without speaking. "Come on," Harris said. "We've got to get the cows in." He had finished eating and was pushed back from the table. I still had half my pancakes to go. "Let him eat," Glennis said. "He doesn't know how to eat fast yet." Harris grew quiet but pulled at my shirt and whispered, "Come on." I ate as fast as I could. Envy for Louis's technique grew strong in me, and still chewing, followed Harris out the door. Into pitch darkness. I had forgotten that it wasn't light yet, and before I realized it, I took a step off the porch and tumbled into the yard. Tarnation, can't you even walk? Harris dragged me up and disappeared in the darkness, headed in the direction of the barn. The path proved to be an obstacle course. I tripped on a board lying on the ground, took a header over the yard gate, bounced off a granary wall, walked full on into a tractor, and finally arrived at the barn because Harris had taken pity on me and had at last led me by the hand. I did not understand what getting the cows in meant or why he would want them in. By this time, I was swearing constantly, using words I had learned from soldiers in the Philippines, and pretty much didn't give a damn, how I thought, if I ever saw a cow, or Harris for that matter. Harris led me through the darkened barn. The smell of manure stopped me cold, and out the back door where he stopped and stepped off to the side and seemed to be fumbling with something. There was a rustle of paper, another moment of silence, and then a flare as he struck a match and lit a hand-rolled cigarette. He took a deep drag, inhaled, and blew smoke. A man likes a good smoke after he eats. You want one? In the glow from the cigarette, he held out a cloth sack of Bull Durham, which is a kind of tobacco, with wheat straw papers on the side. I had never rolled a cigarette, had only tried smoking once, without inhaling, with my mother's cork-tipped old golds. But I wasn't about to admit it to Harris. Sure, give me one. He had to light 4 matches to give me enough light to see, but I at last got one rolled, a pitiful, lumpy-looking thing that threatened to fall apart. He lit the end of it with the flare from the 4th match, and, not to be outdone, I took a deep drag, as he had done, and inhaled. The effects were immediate and spectacular. The smoke went halfway down. I gagged, choked, and instantly lost all the pancakes that I had eaten in a spray that nearly covered Harris. He jumped back. You don't know nothing, do you? In back of the barn was a quagmire of manure and urine, chewed into a perpetual muck by the cows, and I dropped the cigarette into this mess and leaned against the barn wall, vomiting. Harris retrieved the cigarette, brushed the burning end off, and put the remaining tobacco back in the sack. This is hard to come by. I had to steal it from Louie, and he's got eyes like a hawk. Now come on, let's go get the cows. He moved off in the darkness, walking barefoot across the center of the mud and manure, and I followed without thinking. In 2 steps, I was in over my tennis shoes. I jumped back, cow crap to my knees, and tried to go around. Harris was out of sight in the darkness, and I hurried to catch him, still dry heaving at 5-second intervals. There was the faintest gray light in the east by this time, and as I came around the side of the mucky area, I made out a living form in front of me. Wait a minute, I didn't know where... I was hit directly in the groin with such force that it lifted me off the ground, doubling me. I grabbed for the injured area as I started down, vaguely sensing that I was about to start puking again. And then something slammed into the top of my head, and my world ended in an explosion of white light. And that is the end of the 2nd chapter.